All right, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so before we move on to new material for class 3, were there any questions from anything that we covered in class 2? Guess. Is that a no?
No, Venerable, we're all good, thank you.
All right. Okay. So for the remaining, including tonight, the remaining 3 classes in the series, we're going to start using short text. It can be called a lamrim prayer. It can be called a glance meditation on the lamrim. The title of the text is The Foundation of All Good Qualities. It's a text composed by Lama Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, as I mentioned before, the particular school of Tibetan Buddhism that FPMT and our center is therefore, representing, affiliated with. That is what we will be using to guide all of the remaining material for the course. And as a glance meditation on the lamrim, it covers in a very brief way all of the major topics that the Buddha taught in terms of the sutra teachings, the public discourses of the Buddha. So this lamrim prayer or glance meditation on the lamrim, in and of itself, it isn't really meant to teach a person lamrim, which we'll start to get into what all of that means. Really, it's something, as I said, it's a glance meditation on the lamrim. It's something that people often will memorize. It's 2 pages, 3 pages. And by memorizing it and then reciting it, a person familiarizes themselves with all of the different parts of the Buddha's teachings. So it's something that a person might recite every day to kind of, as I say, be able to give themselves a very broad overview or glance kind of through all of the topics, all in a very, very condensed format. But in and of itself, without additional commentary, it doesn't really teach a person lamrim. For that, you need much more in-depth commentaries. So the lamrim, we'll start now to talk about what I mean by all of this. The lamrim itself, Lamrim, translates into English in different ways, most commonly the stages of the path to enlightenment. And it is an effort, it is a much later effort because the Buddha appeared in the world, 25, no worries. The lamrim, as I say, is a much later effort in Tibetan Buddhism, as the Buddha appeared 2,600 years ago. The lamrim was really begun by, as it says here, Lama Atisha. Lama Atisha wrote a text called Lamp for the Path, which was the first effort in going back through the sutra material. By this time, you can see Lama Atisha's dates here on the screen. So as you can see, about 15 100 years after the Buddha. If the Buddha was 2,500 years ago and Lama Atisha was about 1,000 years ago, we're talking 1,500 years after the Buddha appeared in the world. So of course we had the sutras at this time, all existent. And so these great masters began to go through the sutra material and to condense it, to systematize it, to create sort of practice books for practitioners so that not everyone would have to go back through the lamrim, through the sutra material. So all of the essential points of the sutra material was extracted, condensed, and systematized. That's the theory of the lamrim. That's why great masters began to compose lamrim texts. And the first of those, as I say, was Lamp for the Path, um, written by Lama Atisha. Okay, but we will be uh, sorry. Oh, yes. So we will be. So okay. So the lamrim is organized. I think most of the lamrim texts. There's 18 great lamrim commentaries, and I think the majority of them are composed into what are called these three scopes: the small scope, the middling scope, and the great scope. So these three scopes, they are organized in accordance with the motivation of the practitioner. So a practitioner on the small scope is a practitioner whose motivation is to close the door to the worst kinds of suffering that exist within cyclic existence. So those would be rebirths in the quote unquote the hell realms, the quote unquote hungry ghost realms, and then the animal realm. Using the English translations of the Tibetan terms, those kinds of rebirths are where you have the greatest level of overt, most pervasive physical and mental sufferings. So naturally, when a person, kind of starts to learn about cyclic existence, and they start to learn about, these lower realms, the makes sense that they start there. They start with thinking, well, that sounds really terrible. So I'm motivated to do what I need to do to close the door to the lower realms. Um, so, so you can see here that Buddhist practice begins on the small scope. So really, until a person can say that they are genuinely doing everything that they can be doing to close the door to the lower realms, they really haven't begun to practice the Buddhist path. They're aspiring, you would say that they are aspiring to become a small scope practitioner, which is fine, totally, and of course, there's many people who may only take individual parts of Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist psychology, and that's fine too. Of course, there's no reason why anyone needs to or should become Buddhist, but if a person does become Buddhist, then really, from this perspective, that person is aspiring to be a small scope practitioner until they can validly say that is their genuine motivation, that every single day they are laser focused on putting an end to the worst kinds of rebirth. But that motivation is, somewhat more limited than other motivations. A person can mature in their spiritual journey, and when they do that, if they do that, they would begin to, as they learn more, they meditate more, they get a deeper understanding of everything that the Buddha taught. What they would realize is that we don't need to only be concerned about the sufferings of the lower realms. That yes, it makes sense to close the door to the lower realms. That's quite useful. But the upper realms are also not great. We ourselves, as humans, we have an upper realm rebirth. And yet we can look around and we can see and we can validate in our own direct experience that we suffer. And there's, quite painful circumstances that even these upper realm rebirths are subject to. And even in the upper, the further upper realms, they may not have the same level of overt distress that we experience, but those lifetimes, they're limited, and then they end, and the mind falls back down into more suffering types of existences. So aiming for good, good upper realm rebirths really isn't a good in and of itself. It has a limitation that is baked into that striving. So a practitioner on the middling scope becomes wary of all of cyclic existence and turns away from wanting to continue to create the causes and the conditions to take rebirth within cyclic existence. And a Theravadan practitioner is going to stop here, is going to really cultivate that weariness with cyclic existence. And they're going to use that weariness with cyclic existence to motivate them to achieve individual liberation. But so the small scope and the middling scope are paths that are held in common with practitioners of the Theravadan tradition. The great scope is unique to the Mahayana tradition. On the great scope, a practitioner deepens and expands their motivation to recognize that it is true that upper realm rebirths are not a good in and of themselves, and that they are not what a person should be striving toward as an intrinsic good, but upper realm rebirths can play a role in a person's spiritual growth and development if a person, and likely a person would, need a succession of good human rebirths to complete all of the training that's necessary to achieve enlightenment. So, on the great scope, the person, they do have that weariness with cyclic existence. They're not caught up in cyclic existence, but they recognize that individual liberation would not allow them to be of benefit to all of the remaining ordinary sentient beings that are still experiencing cyclic existence. So, on the great scope, the practitioner is motivated to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, which, as I say, is unique to the Mahayana tradition. There is no great scope in Theravadan practice. Okay. Is that all clear? Any questions so far? All right. So there are four features of, as I say, that this is a later commentarial effort. And when a person, and it really, for a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, the study and the practice of the lamrim is really the heart of what is done. And when a person approaches their practice of Buddhism through the lens of the lamrim, there are four features or four benefits to that approach. The first is that none of the teachings, a person comes to understand that none of the teachings are contradictory. So, as I mentioned previously, the Buddha wandered around and came across different people and gave teachings that were suitable to whomever he was addressing. And so that was memorialized later in the sutras. And so, of course, when you've got one group of people who are quite advanced, you've got another group of people who are quite, beginner, or who are holding strongly maybe to a very a wrong view, and they're not maybe ready, not prepared to go all the way in their thinking all at once, then in order to be skillful, the Buddha is going to have to sort of tailor things and say, well, for you, since you are ready to, take a big leap, I'll give you, these advanced teachings, and these other people who aren't prepared for that, I'm going to give you, more provisional teachings, less of the subtlest, most refined teachings. And when you come across both of those about the same topic in the sutras, that can seem like a contradiction. But when you understand the sutras to be organized by those three scopes, by what the motivation of the practitioner is, then you can see how what the Buddha is really doing is guiding all sentient beings through all three scopes. That's his intent. Whether we do that or not is up to us. But you can see how the sutras as a whole, that's the goal of that the Buddha had, was to take a person from small scope to middle scope to great scope. And so the teachings are playing these roles, and they themselves, they're intended for people of different capacities, but they themselves, the teachings themselves, are not contradictory. Okay, and then we can see that, as I said, what the Buddha is showing us is how we, as a practitioner, progress from beginning to end. So everything that the Buddha taught is personal practice advice. There's no teaching in the sutras that's just like a factoid, an interesting thing to kind of understand, just like dry knowledge. Everything is intended to be put into practice at the right time, at the right place, with, in order to accomplish the result of mastering the small scope, mastering the middle scope, mastering the great scope. And then there's the three, what's called the threefold path, this other advantage. We've talked about, or feature of the lamrim. We talked about one of these threefold paths, which is the how the lamrim is organized into small scope, middle scope, and great scope. Also, the you can talk about the three results or the three principal aspects of the path. What are the three realizations that we're meant to get out of these three scopes? And those are renunciation, the correct view of the nature of reality, and bodhicitta. So these three, what are these three results that we're supposed to get out of our practice? And then again, the teachings are protected from the fault of abandoning the Dharma. So again, if we understand that that the Buddha taught the small scope for certain practitioners, the middle scope for other practitioners, and the great scope for other practitioners, then we might say, well, I'm learning about Tibetan Buddhism. I like this idea of bodhicitta. I like this idea of full enlightenment. But those are great scope practices. So I aspire to become a great scope practitioner, but I understand that in order to get there, I have to engage in the practices that are held in common with practitioners of the small scope and the middle scope. So we don't denigrate the teachings that exist in the sutras that are helpful for practitioners who are engaging in the practices of the small scope, engaging in the practices of the middle scope, because we see them as necessary to get to the great scope. So we don't say, well, that's a small scope teaching, that's a Theravadan practice or Theravadan teaching. I don't need it. It's not for me. I'm a Mahayana practitioner. That's not that would be abandoning what the Buddha taught. That would be denigrating the Buddha's teachings, and that's inappropriate. We see that everything has a place and everything is leading into the great scope. Okay. Any questions about the features of the lamrim? Okay, so now we will move into the small scope from the Foundation of All Good Qualities, Lama Tsongkhapa's text. And as I said, the purpose of the small scope is to ultimately gain freedom, gain protection from the lower realm rebirths. Which, as I mentioned, even if we aspire to the great scope, if we are subject to these lower realm rebirths, then our progress toward enlightenment will be derailed, again and again, um, in really unhelpful ways when we have to, because we ourselves, we would have to agree that we are subject to, we have not moved beyond um, lower realm rebirths. And so if that is a concern for us, then taking those detours into the lower realms again and again is going to greatly expand how long it's going to take to achieve enlightenment, which means that sentient beings will continue to suffer as they wait for us to get our act together and to create this succession of perfect human rebirths that we need in order to quickly accomplish our goal of achieving enlightenment. Okay, so this is verse 1 of the Foundation of All Good Qualities. So you can see here what this verse is introducing is the idea. Here they use the phrase guru devotion, is the one translation. Properly relying on the guru or the spiritual guide is another way of translating. I don't actually know what the Tibetan for guru devotion is, but there's a phrase, and proper reliance is maybe a better term, but guru devotion is a widely used translation as well. So what this is getting at is that in Tibetan Buddhism in particular, the relationship between the student and the spiritual guide is really emphasized, is really talked about, is really has an important role that is understood in the teachings, because that's the person from whom we receive all of the teachings. We may have, of course, many teachers over our lives. This is talking about the idea of a root teacher, a root guru, the person from whom we rely on the most, the person that we go to again and again, that we form the closest bond to. And of course, that could still be more than one person, maybe one person for a time. Could be that person passes away, and then we form a different close bond. That certainly possible. But this is really particularly talking about the person that we have the closest bond to and how important it is. So this is a huge topic. Guru devotion, proper reliance is a huge topic in the Lamrim. Geshe Sherab's retreat in September, his weekend retreat, is going to be related to this topic of proper reliance. So it is something that we train in, how to have this respectful, appropriate relationship with the person that we ourselves are choosing. No one's telling us this is your root guru. We we make that choice. We enter into that relationship. And if and when we do that, then it does become important that we, treat that person appropriately, respectfully. Just because someone, just because someone is a teacher and they may be the root guru of someone we know, or they may have a role in the world where they're many people's root guru, doesn't mean that they're an appropriate root teacher for oneself. We make that choice based on their, how they're manifesting in the world, how they, what works for our mind. But it's the person really who benefits our mind the most. So of course, I think it's not something to rush into. There are, I think, because it is so talked about in Tibetan Buddhism, people feel like they can't make any progress or they can't do anything without a root guru, and that's not true. We can make progress. We can learn many things from books, from attending teachings without regarding the person that we're taking teachings from as our, root guru. We can begin to implement the things that we are understanding, and we can make a lot of progress. There does come a point where, in order to make even more progress, it's incredibly helpful to be able to get feedback, to be able to ask questions, to be able to invite someone to take on this role where we are going to follow their advice. We're going to seek out advice. We're going to follow advice, from them, really personal and in connected way. So that is something that is relevant, becomes relevant, at least at some point. Okay. So then verse 2, and after verse 2, I'll pause again for questions. So verse 2 is now introducing so if you were to study a lamrim text, a lamrim commentary, really all of these verses, as I mentioned, this isn't really teaching you lamrim. The commentaries are going to have whole chapters that are devoted to each of these stanzas. So there's going to be a whole chapter on proper reliance. And now the second major topic is precious human rebirth, or perfect human rebirth, different translations. And again, there'll be a whole chapter. If you were interested in a book on just proper reliance, Lama Zopa Rinpoche wrote a book called The Heart of the Path. And that is a whole entire book on proper reliance. And everything Lama Zopa ever, composed, or was composed from his teachings, it's super intense. So, be prepared. If you choose to read that, it's very intense, as is everything from his teachings. But it probably is the best single whole book on proper reliance that exists, at least that I'm aware of. Okay, so the second topic, perfect human rebirth. So as I mentioned, an important goal within Buddhist practice generally is this idea of perfect human rebirth and wanting to create the conditions of a perfect human rebirth. So we ourselves possess right now a perfect human rebirth, and we'll go through, there are 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth, and we'll look at those. So a perfect human rebirth is a subset of human rebirth. Not all humans have a perfect human rebirth. And so we'll look at why it's a subset. But basically, it is the kind of life, the kind of rebirth that has the fewest obstacles to spiritual growth and development of any possible rebirth within cyclic existence. Maybe you could make some argument for some of the pure lands, but it is debatable actually in terms of those two types of rebirth, as far as which is the most well suited for the most rapid progress. There's different ways of thinking about that. But given that we ourselves have a perfect human rebirth, so one way of thinking about all of these topics in the lamrim is that they are giving us antidotes to problems. The first topic of proper reliance is giving us the antidote or the solution to just kind of thinking, well, you know, every source of information is sort of equal. And, this person, this book, this piece of information, it's all just kind of equal. None of it is special. None of it is really, because again, it's a huge topic, but when you train the mind to regard your own root guru in a very special way, then their advice takes on a power that is different than just reading a book or so on. And that, in and of itself, is very useful in our spiritual lives. With this second topic, there's a danger that we look at our lives and we look at the world and we say, well, there's 8 billion humans or whatever it is, 7 billion humans. It's not, it doesn't mean that much. It's cheap. It's everywhere. It doesn't have significance. It doesn't have meaning. And if we think that way, then we're prone to just sort of give into distraction, to just sort of waste our life. Um, when we understand how precious all of these 18 qualities coming together in a single rebirth really is, then we can see that we shouldn't waste that opportunity because of how unlikely it is for it to come together. We have it right now. We can say, I possess this presently. And so I should just squeeze, as it says here, unceasingly day and night take its essence. So we think how unbelievable it is that these 18 qualities have all come together simultaneously. And I have this mind blowing opportunity to make spiritual progress. So, what a shame it would be to not take advantage of this, not to devote myself to spiritual progress. That's the antidote that to the wrong way of thinking that we're exposing ourselves to by understanding what the Buddha is teaching us here. Okay, so these 18 qualities are. Should I pause here before we go on, or are there any questions?
I was I've been reading the lamrim and I was just summarizing everything. In the first chapter, which he referenced, that it's interesting that the lamrim starts with guru devotion as the first thing because it's the most difficult thing for us human beings. But it went further to say that without guru devotion, enlightenment is impossible. What are your thoughts? I mean, not your thoughts, but how do you reconcile that with not necessarily having a guru? Because everybody doesn't have a guru. A lot of people on this path don't have a guru. It's really hard for Westerners, from conversations I've had, to even conceptualize giving their whole the essence of their enlightenment to this person
Mm.
that they don't even have access to most of the times.
Yeah. Um, I mean, of course, there we are generally speaking encouraged to take the long view of our spiritual development. And so, are we, how likely is it that one way or another we really would achieve enlightenment in this rebirth? Um, we may, I mean, certainly the teachings express that it's possible that it can be done within a single human rebirth, but even under the best circumstances, what's the probability of that? Um, so, what I would say is, that it shouldn't be rushed. It shouldn't be jumped into, because if you make a mistake in who you make that connection to, someone who actually is unethical, or actually, there, that becomes, if at some point you see them in a very negative light in your own mind, then that is a tremendous obstacle to your spiritual progress. So yeah, it's an incredible, it's a very difficult, idea. That's certainly true. And we need to be able to have the wisdom to check, there, and of course there are no guarantees. There are examples of high lamas who seem to have ethical lapses that were incredibly painful for many students. Um, and so there's no guarantees. We can't say that there's a particular way of checking that is 100% accurate. Um, which is why we do need to go slowly, and we need to do as much investigating as possible. Um, and if it doesn't come together in this life, then um, you know yeah, that could mean that the state of enlightenment may not manifest in this life. um, but we still may create incredibly positive karmic seeds. We may purify a great deal of negative karma. We may make a great deal of progress. And maybe in our next life, all of that hard work creates, even better conditions, that there's an incredible spiritual guide that we feel connected to, that everything just kind of clicks and falls into place for us, and we make, even more progress. Um, so, I think we shouldn't get caught up in thinking about, well, that if everything isn't necessarily going to come together right now, then that means everything is lost, or everything is pointless, or it's hopeless, or, um, we make prayers to meet our spiritual guide. Um, we try to do everything that we can, and it may or may not, come together, and that's okay. We just make do with everything that is available to us, because still, I mean, how many practitioners had access to this level of teaching? All of, maybe we don't regard them as our spiritual guide, but how many people can just get on a plane and, travel to Dharamsala, travel to, wherever, and get all of these incredible, meet these Rinpoches, these High Lamas. I mean, really, in all of human history, how many people were more fortunate than us? I don't think that there were any people who were. Um, so, we should just sort of count our blessings and do everything that's within our grasp today. And then tomorrow we see. We see if that hard work changes our karma, changes things. And if not in this lifetime, then, maybe the next one.
Yeah. One more clarifying question. Can you how would you differentiate between a teacher and a guru? Because I feel like my question is, can you take empowerment with a person and see them as a teacher as opposed to being a guru, or does it have to be, once you've taken the empowerment, do you have to cultivate that guru disciple relationship?
From the so a person can have more than one guru,
Right.
more than one teacher. Generally, a person at one time, a person may only have, generally one root guru. So if a person takes empowerment, then from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, necessarily that is one of a person's teachers. Um, and it therefore does become important to cultivate maybe not the same kind of depth of the relationship, because you may never see them again, right? You may, um,
Sure.
and you may never talk to them. They may pass away. I mean, all kinds of things. But the same general training, the same general practice does apply, um, which does mean that we do need to be careful still. If we shouldn't rush into empowerment either. Just be like, oh, this person is coming to town. I'm not going to check anything. I'm not going to look into their reputation. I'm not going to, I'm just going to go. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to go. That would be a mistake. We do need to do our best to feel comfortable, um, being able to train in having a really respectful relationship with them. Um, because if we learn something later, we need to be able to deal with that without anger, without just what they call despising, giving them up, despising them. that would that is a tremendous obstacle to spiritual growth, if and when it were to happen. So they would become a teacher of oneself, but not necessarily one's root guru. If it's a highest yoga tantra empowerment, then that person becomes one's vajra master, necessarily, which is very serious, very deep, necessarily.
Okay. Thank you.
And then, Venerable, if one of those teachers has a wish and we have an opportunity to fulfill that or put effort into that wish, if we say, oh, I don't think that they're my teacher, they're not my root guru, so I don't really need to put effort into this, that would be the wrong thing, wouldn't it?
I guess, I mean, in a way, it depends on. So, if a person asks a question of a teacher, then they should be prepared to follow the advice that they themselves are given, um, which means that we need to think carefully about how we phrase our questions, right? So, if maybe you have this idea like, oh, I'm thinking about doing retreat. Um, and so if you go to your teacher and you're like, I'm thinking about doing retreat, what retreat should I do? That's a very broad, very open-ended question. They might say, okay, well, there's this 6-month retreat in Sri Lanka. You should go do that. And then if you're not prepared to do that, that's pretty awkward. Like you should address that at that time. You shouldn't just go off and not do it. You should address that in the conversation. But now you kind of are having an awkward conversation. Whereas if you thought about what retreat you could do, and you say, okay, there's this 2-week retreat or there's this 2-week retreat, I'm happy to do either one, which is more beneficial. Um, and then they pick one for you, then you go and do that, and everything is good. So when we seek out personal advice, we should be prepared to implement the advice that we're given, and we should try to be careful about what we're getting ourselves into. If they kind of talk about things that they hold to be important, then that's not necessarily quite the same thing. Um, if they talk about like, well, people should try to do like a 3-year retreat, like they say, well, that's kind of useful, or something. I mean, if you want to give me a specific, if you're comfortable giving me like a more specific thing, I could talk about a more specific thing. Um, But if they're just kind of generally talking about what they think is helpful, and we think, well, I'm not ready for that, that's totally fine. Um, but what's relevant is if and when we go to the teacher and we make a request, then it becomes important to whatever it is that they say, even if it's difficult, we should try to find a way to do it.
Okay. So the example I'm thinking of is that we're currently working with a teacher doing teacher training kind of thing within a group. And the teachers now said, look, I've done some teachings and I've shown you how to do the teachings. It would be good if each one of you can do a session as a um, as a like a training to show that you can do teachings. Um, and then the question is, well, do I really regard this as my teacher? And then my point is that, well, we've taken empowerment with this teacher. So if his wish is for us to do some training, teaching sessions in a close group, we should put effort into making that happen rather than saying, oh, I don't think I want to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about trusting, that person and having confidence in them. Um, I mean, at that stage, you're just, you're not necessarily going out into the world. And, I would say you try to think of it as like a gift, trying to think of, giving the Dharma in whatever way you
Yeah.
can, is one of the ways that we practice generosity, with others. So, and getting more and more skilled in that, of course, you know, if you just feel comfortable leading like more basic meditations or what have you, still that can have a profoundly beneficial impact on others. Um, so in that environment, it isn't like you're saying, well, I'm going to, hold myself out there in the world as like some sort of, fully qualified so and so. Um, but it's a gradual, so you can certainly go to this person and say, I feel like I have these limitations, but of course everybody has limitation. That's it's a process, right? You're trying to develop over a long period of time more skills, more ability, more competency. Um, and you're not doing it in a in a arrogant way. Again, you're being guided, you're doing it under someone else's advice and so on. You're not just striking out on your own and saying, oh well, look at me, I have all of these qualities. And you're just doing your best to maybe offer some service to others. So I think that you know that can certainly be, over a long period of time, making progress, going in that direction, I think can be a really, a great gift.
Yeah. Thank you.
But yeah, I mean, it's very uncomfortable, for a long time, I think. Yeah. Okay, so the 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth, they're organized into what are called the freedoms and the endowments. So the freedoms are negative things that don't characterize our present existence. We have a perfect human rebirth, and therefore we are free from these negative things that other sentient beings are experiencing. As it says here, we presently are not experiencing a rebirth in the hell realm, the hungry ghost realm, or the spirit realm, the animal realm, or even what's called the celestial realm, the upper realm. So I mentioned lower realms, upper realms, the celestial realms, or the upper realms. But the celestial realms are not really what we should be striving for. As I said, maybe there's less overt suffering there, but still you're just kind of wasting your time. You're taking this upper realm rebirth. It's there's a lot of distraction to sensory enjoyment in the upper realms. So they're not really very well suited to spiritual progress. So they're actually considered a hindrance to rapid spiritual progress. So we don't want to take rebirth there, and we should rejoice that that's not what we're experiencing, because we would just be using up a lot of good karma to maintain that upper realm rebirth. Also, we have not been born presently this lifetime at a time when a Buddha has not appeared in the world. They've not taught, where the teachings don't continue to be practiced. We also don't have what are called defective sense powers, which refers to blindness, deafness, and intellectual disabilities, or things that would impede a person's cognitive ability. So, I mean, of course, I think with some of that technology and so on has from this historical time period of 2,500 years ago, certainly those are less of an issue than they were at this time, but they would still, they would be obstacles to spiritual growth, to being able to hear the teachings, because again, particularly back then, most people were illiterate. They received the teachings orally. So if you were deaf, you were kind of out of luck. You couldn't really go to a teaching and receive the teachings. There's maybe something to be said about the imprints that can come from being able to see holy objects, being able to see images of enlightened beings, so there are maybe some drawbacks still. And then wrong views means clinging very tightly to philosophical perspectives that make spiritual progress from the Buddhist perspective not possible, like deciding that the law of karma is just nonsense. It's just made up. It's not a thing, that the Buddha just invented it. If a person holds very strongly to that view and they're not willing to investigate the law of karma, then that's going to be an obstacle to their spiritual growth. So these are negative states that we are free from, that don't presently characterize our life. Any questions about the freedoms? Okay, so then we have the endowments, and these are positive things that do characterize our life. So there are circumstantial endowments and personal endowments. Circumstantial endowments refer to environmental experiences that are present in our world. So, and in many ways, these are just the opposite of some of the freedoms, the negative things. So it is true that on this planet at this time, a Buddha has appeared in the world. That Buddha has taught the complete teachings. Those teachings still exist presently, even 2,500 years later. There are practitioners who understand those teachings, who can explain them to us. And there are favorable conditions, meaning that there are places of learning, places of retreat, places where Buddhist practitioners can find support. This may not all be true in 100 years. There could be nuclear war tomorrow, and these things may not be true. But presently, these are true for this planet, this lifetime, in our world. These are all facts that are characterizing what we can access in our world. But of course, there could be some kind of global shift where there are no more favorable conditions, where Buddhism becomes outlawed globally and there are no more followers. of the teachings. The teachings are, and there are periods, historically, where regions came close to this, where regions came close to the teachings being completely wiped out before the internet and so on. So, certainly not everyone has had that experience. And then there are personal endowments. So these refer to our body and mind. We have been born human. We have been born in what's called a central land, which is a place where the teachings, as I said, regionally, the teachings aren't available even now. If you're in North Korea, if you're in Somalia, if you're in, failed states, that's not a central land because you may have absolutely no access to the teachings. We do have intact sense faculties, and we've not committed what are called the five heinous actions, or the five actions of immediate retribution, which is to intentionally take the life of one's birth mother, birth father, to take the life of an arhat, to do what's called maliciously wounding a Buddha, or to create what's called a schism in the Sangha, to go into a functioning Buddhist community and kind of, rend that functioning, harmonious community into a non-functioning group, by spreading lies, or by trying to sow division, to sow discord, to make a harmonious Buddhist community no longer functional, particularly a community of monks and nuns. That's to create a schism in the Sangha. And those five negative actions are particularly karmically powerful. They, in general, when we create a negative karma or a positive karma, that negative or positive karma isn't necessarily going to ripen at the time that we die. It will ripen unless it's purified, but it's we don't know. Could ripen in 1,000 lifetimes. But these five actions of what are called immediate retribution, and retribution is a terrible word because it makes it sound like someone's doing it to us. But the idea is that they're so powerful that they do ripen at the end of that lifetime, unless they're purified. It's quite difficult to purify but it's possible. There are no, as we said before, there are no negative actions that can't be purified. But if you create one of these five, you've only got until the end of that life to purify it, because it's definitely going to ripen at the end of that life. That's because it's so karmically, the objects of those, the karmic objects that we're relating to are so karmically powerful that it ripens immediately upon death. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to commit any of the five actions of immediate retribution. Okay, so those are the 18 qualities of a perfect human rebirth, the freedoms and the endowments. And by contemplating how we ourselves are in possession of these 18 qualities, we can, as I said, we can see how extraordinary our lives are. And when we are deeply in touch with how extraordinary our lives are, naturally we turn away from non-virtue, naturally we turn away from distraction, naturally we become interested, motivated in practice. And that's why we're encouraged to contemplate these 18 qualities and to see how we ourselves are in possession of them, because it creates a really strong foundation for spiritual practice. Any questions about precious human or perfect human rebirth?
Venerable, Buddhist teachings, they're not going to survive forever. So that's sort of when we say, oh, maybe I can progress in the next life or the next life, do we not come to a point that there's no Buddhist teachings, even though we have a human rebirth?
Well, um, so from the Buddhist cosmological perspective, there are, the earth is absolutely understood to not be the only place where there are humans, and not the only place where a a Buddha like Shakyamuni Buddha manifested, appeared, in that place. There are, many, many worlds, a huge, who knows, uncountable numbers of world systems that have humans. Not all of them were places, as it says, of course, a perfect human rebirth is a subset of human rebirth. So certainly, of course, even on this planet, 2,800 years ago, nobody had a perfect human rebirth because no Buddha had appeared, in the world in such a way where the teachings, there may have been Buddhas who appeared in the world, um, and they may have given some teachings to maybe to some, but they weren't, you know, they weren't broad in the same way. So um, it was so, at least it was incredibly less. But of course, over the last 2,500 years, we would have to say that more and more people were able to gain, because even when the Buddha appeared during his lifetime, only the people who came in direct contact with him could say that they lived at a time and a place where the Buddha appeared and the teachings existed. And even then, did the complete teachings exist, right? All of the teachings from, they may have only heard some of the teachings. Really, so honestly, it became easier and easier to practice the teachings as time has gone on. But, certainly there, the world is, we've got climate change, we've got the risk of nuclear war, we've got all kinds of things, and things could get real bad, in the future. And the teachings could certainly, and just like there used to be a time when the Egyptians knew like what their texts meant and knew how to do their practices, and now nobody does. Nobody practices the sun gods and all of the Egyptian kinds of thing. And Buddhism could certainly become like that in 1,000 years, 5,000 years. But there are other worlds where Buddhas have appeared and have done the same sort of thing that Shakyamuni Buddha did on this planet. So the idea would be that through our practice, we are not necessarily creating the conditions to come back immediately in, a few weeks on this planet after we die on this planet. We may, but we could certainly maybe be coming back on a different planet where the conditions are still good, the conditions are similar. And it would be due to the fact that the karma that we've created is matching, is similar to the kinds of karmic experiences that the humans on that planet are able to have. So because of what's happening on the earth right now, there are minds from other places that are kind of magnetized to this karmic experience, and are having this really fortunate, experience of maybe taking rebirth in Dharamsala, where the Dalai Lama is, present, and all kinds of things, because that is what's occurring. But it's not the only place where that sort of thing is occurring. Um, so and there are no guarantees, of course, but that's kind of the theory, is that if we do everything that is possible, everything that can be done, then somewhere there's a karmic ripening, a karmic happening that we will be sort of magnetized to, where te- highly qualified teachers exist, the complete teachings exist, and so on, when you consider like the universe as a whole.
So if that's the case, then somewhere like Amitabha Buddha's Pure Land would be a better rebirth, wouldn't it, than just a human rebirth?
There's an argument for that idea. Certainly, there are different kinds of Pure Lands. Not not in all Pure Lands are the complete teachings exist. So, from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, a person has to practice Vajrayana in order to actually achieve enlightenment. You don't have to practice Vajrayana in this lifetime, but at some point you have to practice Vajrayana. You can't achieve enlightenment without practicing Vajrayana. And a human, so it's a complicated, there are certainly certain kinds of Pure Land rebirths where you are you have a very long lifetime. The circumstances are quite conducive and so on. The drawback is that generally speaking, you do stay there for very long periods of time. So there is an argument that some people make where they pray to take rebirth actually in the human realm, even though it's less certain, because the human body, the sort of constituents of the human body for Vajrayana practice um, are very well suitable for that. Um, and within just a few lifetimes, meaning a couple of 100 years, they can achieve full enlightenment. Um, so, yes, I mean, within Buddhism, Pure Land practice is widely adopted, and certainly there's a lot to commend it. Um, but it is a little bit debated, in terms of this idea. If we don't want to take rebirth in the lower realms because it's going to delay our enlightenment, then if we take rebirth in certain Pure Lands, if we've got to stay there for incredibly long periods of time, that's also kind of delaying our enlightenment. But it is a sort of safe route also that's free of certain pitfalls that are so it takes a very brave attitude to kind of reject that. But some bodhisattvas, they argue in different ways on that topic. So there's no one like absolutely right answer, I guess.
Thank you, Venerable.
Okay. So the next major topic is introducing impermanence and death. So we just got done thinking about how amazing this life is, right? All of its freedoms, all of its endowments. And now we have to come to grips with the fact that it's going to end. This particular human rebirth is going to end. Um, so that's impermanence and death. And then this is also introducing the idea of karma, the law of cause and effect, because our next rebirth is a karmically driven process. The coming into this life was a karmically driven process. What's going to happen between this life and the next life is a karmically established or karmically driven process. So there's two major ideas that are being introduced here. The teaching on impermanence and death, what this is doing, the antidote, the spiritual antidote that this is giving us is to, even though we might contemplate how amazing this life is, we might think, well, tomorrow, next week, next month, when I have better conditions, when things are, I'm less stressed, I have more time in the future. But when we really deeply contemplate impermanence and death, and we recognize the truth that we don't know if we're going to be alive tomorrow, we don't know if we're going to be alive in an hour. That's just a fact. We don't want to think that way, and we're not good at thinking that way. But unavoidably, that's a fact. Like the Buddha isn't bumming us out for no reason. He's just telling us what's true. We can't be certain that tomorrow that we're going to wake up tomorrow in this life, or if we're going to wake up tomorrow in the next life. So we overcome laziness, we overcome distraction by deeply contemplating impermanence and death. And then with karma, okay, so then, right, so we're going to come back to, we're going to elaborate on karma. Verse 4 is going more deeply into karma by saying, when I find firm and definite conviction in the law of cause and effect, then what I'm going to do on the basis of that is to abandon all negative karma and to devote myself to virtuous karma, constructive karma. So, verse 3, just like a shadow follows the body, the results of black and white karma follow. So, black and white karma is just a poetic way of saying constructive and destructive, positive or negative. Once we come to terms with the fact that things are not random, that our next rebirth is going to be karmically established, then we really become driven to, as it says in verse 4, to abandon all negative karma and accomplish all virtuous deeds. So now we're going to talk about karma. So there's, as I mentioned, there's positive karma and negative karma. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about the lay vows, when we talked about killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, taking intoxicants. We mentioned that, of course, these are overt actions, but we said that they were really proxies for negative mental states, that when we are motivated to kill, to steal, to lie, etc., it is because there is a really, self-centered, self-interested, egotistical thought arising in the mind. We want to manipulate someone else to get what we want. We have strong anger, strong aversion arising in the mind, all kinds of what they would call afflicted states, negative mental states. These are mental states that are preceding these harmful actions. People don't go around killing and stealing and so on while they are absorbed in the mind of generosity, the mind of loving kindness, the mind of compassion. They do that when they are absorbed in these really negative, painful, self-centered states of mind. And it is the energy of those states of mind that the Buddha is concerned about and wants us to be concerned about. So whether a karmic action, which is motivated by either a positive or a negative state of mind, whether it's positive or negative, we can talk about a complete karma or an incomplete karma. And a complete karma has 4 factors, and an incomplete karma has less than 4 factors. And complete and incomplete is an important distinction only because when a person, sentient being, dies, a karma is going to ripen that is going to establish their next rebirth. And only a complete karma has that kind of power. Incomplete karmas still have power, but they ripen as experiences within a lifetime. They don't have the power to throw a person into a rebirth. So that's the only distinction between complete or incomplete. So there are incomplete or complete positive, or incomplete or complete negative karmas. So for a karma, positive or negative, to be complete, these are the four things that have to be together. So the basis is the sentient being that you are relating to. Um, so, for example, the basis of your action might be a cockroach in your kitchen, right? You aren't mad at cockroaches in general. You don't have a problem with cockroaches in general. There's a specific cockroach that's in your kitchen that you are looking at, and that is the basis of your action. You might be really unhappy that it's in your space. You might have a lot of aversion arising in your mind, which is going to give rise to the intention. In that example, your intention might be to kill that cockroach. You haven't dedicated yourself to driving around town, murdering cockroaches ad nauseum, but there is one cockroach in your kitchen that you are averse to. And so for you, that is the basis of your karmic action. Conversely, you might have compassion for the cockroach. You might pick it up, you might take it outside, you might recite mantras. So the same basis, but different intentions. And one intention is based on aversion arising in the mind. One intention is based on compassion or loving kindness arising in the mind. Then you engage in an act. The act is really what is intended or what is meant to allow you to actualize your intention. So if your intention was to take care of the cockroach, you might get a piece of paper, you might carefully lift it up, you might gently take it outside and put it in the grass. That's the act. The act is a course of physical behaviors with the goal of making manifest your intention. Or you take off your shoe and you smack the cockroach, or you intend to, you bring your hand down in an aggressive way. And that is just an effort to manifest your intention to take the life of the cockroach. And then your act has to be completed in order for it to be a complete karmic action. So the cockroach has to actually die. If the cockroach scurries out of the way and your shoe just hits the floor, it's not a complete action of killing. It's an incomplete action that's still negative, right? Because you had all of the other pieces of the puzzle. You really tried, you did your best, and it just got out of the way. So it's not positive, it's not good, but it could have been worse had you actually killed the cockroach. So it's important here to distinguish between karma and morality. Karma is not based on a system of like social responsibility, people's rights, pro-social actions. It's very much about what is happening in your mind as you're engaging in an action. What is the energy that is present in your mind when you're engaging in an action? And the result of that action, if you are successful in doing what you set out to do, and what you set out to do was harmful, then that's more intense. That karmic seed is more intense than if you set out to do something negative and you were prevented. Conversely, we would hope that if we set out to do something positive, that we were able to complete that karmic action. If not, it's still quite good, but it could just have been more powerful if that positive karmic action was completed. So, and again, it just means whether or not whether or not that karmic seed can ripen as an actual rebirth, or it can only ripen as an experience. Are there any questions about incomplete or complete karmic actions?
Um, so, Venerable, does that mean that the karmas that we end up experiencing in this life are all incomplete karmas, or can the complete karma still ripen as well?
I'm pretty sure. I don't know that I've ever read a definitive explanation. I think it's kind of like, squares and rectangles, like, all complete, all like, so a complete karma is also called a throwing karma, because it throws you into the next rebirth. So all throwing karmas are completed karmas. Um, but I don't think that all, and then what's strange about the English is that a karma that ripens as experience is called a completing karma, which is just terrible branding. Throwing karma, because it's largely, a lot of times they're incomplete karmas, right? So incomplete karmas are completing karmas. It's terrible English, or terrible grammar, but I would assume it would be my assumption that it can certainly be the case that a complete karma can be a completing karma. But an incomplete karma just can't be a throwing karma. Um, but I would imagine that as we, because karma is ripening all of the time from many, many different causes. Um, so I would think that, you know, those results probably, maybe when they ripen, they're maybe a bit stronger, maybe they're a bit more long lasting, a bit more durable, something like that. It may be a bit more intense, as they ripen as experience. But I've never heard anything that would suggest that that a complete karma is prohibited from ever arising during a lifetime.
Okay, so the other thing that I've heard is that to complete any karmic activity, whether it's negative or positive, you have to rejoice. So, like if you were killing the cockroach, for instance, you have to kill it and go, "Yes, I've got you," something like that.
So you can, it, with regard to the completion of the negative, or the negative or the positive karma, you have an opportunity to interfere with that if strong regret arises, immediately. Um, if you can cause strong, if it's a negative karma and strong regret arises immediately, then you will weaken the karma. I don't know if there's different like schools of thought in terms of whether or not, because not all of, I mean, not, there isn't necessarily complete agreement on every aspect of Buddhist doctrine among different schools and different lineages and so on. Um, in terms of it being complete or incomplete, it's certainly worse if you think like, oh, I did a really, if it's negative and you think I did a really great thing, I did the right thing, that's certainly worse. If you generate strong regret, the stronger the regret, the quicker you can generate the strong regret, the more you will interfere with that negative karma. That certainly, I can say that's certainly true.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll try to cover a little bit of this before we end. So then we're just going to talk about ethical. So there's a list of what are called the 10 non-virtuous actions. Some of these are the same, or duplicates from the list of the lay vows that we've talked about, but some of these are new. The ones that are not new, we'll just kind of gloss over. So Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit sexual misconduct. These are the ethical guidelines for our bodies. And all of these are the same as the lay vows. Now we have ethical guidelines for our speech. Do not lie is the same. But then now we have three new ones. Do not engage in divisive speech, harsh speech, or idle speech. So these are subtler negative karmas that are not, because they're subtler negative karmas, they're harder to abstain from. But the Buddha is saying, do your best, like try not to do these things. Divisive speech is to sow division between people. Harsh speech is to, raise your voice in anger, to be insulting toward others. And then idle speech technically is to just kind of talk about nonsense, to talk about popular culture, to talk about things that don't matter, things that are not important. We can't really completely avoid idle speech, but we should at least avoid like gossip, talking about people behind their backs, kind of the worst forms of idle speech. And we should try to maintain some awareness of how meaningful our speech is. Are we wasting our time? Are we wasting other people's time by just going on and on about things that don't matter? It's difficult to do that entirely, but some awareness about how much idle speech we're doing, is certainly helpful. And there are definitely forms of idle speech that are quite harmful, like gossip and that sort of thing. And then the ethical guidelines for the mind. These are all new, except for we did talk about wrong views, not in terms of ethics, but in terms of perfect human rebirth. So it's the same concept, strongly holding to a philosophy that makes Buddhist spiritual growth impossible. So covetousness is kind of a greedy mind, a mind that wants to appropriate that which belongs to others. And ill will, so these are ethical guidelines for the mind, right? So we have body, speech, and mind, the three doors through which we create karma. We create karma with our physical body when we steal, when we kill, when we commit sexual misconduct. We commit it with our speech, when we lie, when we use our, create division and so on. These are purely mental karmas. We don't have to say anything. We don't have to physically do anything. We just have to think it in order for it to be negative. So covetousness is just thinking about wanting to appropriate things that belong to other people, giving into envy, giving into jealousy, wanting to figure out a way to get things from other people that are rightfully theirs. Ill will isn't harming anyone, but it's hoping that other people come to harm, wishing ill upon people, thinking, oh, I hope you trip and fall. I hope I hope you get a flat tire. When we just wish ill on other people, that's a negative karma, even though no actions of body or speech are involved. And again, as I say, wrong views is holding very strongly, not willing to investigate the teachings, not willing to be open to the teachings, holding strongly to something that would make Buddhist spiritual growth impossible, like just saying, well, the Buddha made it all up. He's full of nonsense. That would be a wrong view, because from the Buddhist perspective, the Buddha did not invent the law of karma. He's not trying to get us to cooperate or to get us to get along. He's saying, I have seen that this is how that the mind has a deep and subtle interconnection with reality, and that the energy that's arising in the mind manifests in these ways, these karmic appearances, these karmic experiences. And that's just the way that it works. And I'm telling you the way that it works. Just like Einstein told us about, gravity and quantum mechanics and so on. He didn't invent it, he's explaining it. And the Buddhist view is that the Buddha is the same. He didn't invent any of these things. He just came to understand them and he's passing along what he came to understand. So wrong views don't cut off necessarily progress in other religious traditions necessarily, but they would cut off progress in the Buddhist philosophical tradition. And yeah, so they're a concern, from that perspective. And that's all I had for today. I just wanted to try to get through that. Are there any final thoughts or questions?
Thank you, Venerable. That was very good.
Of course, of course. All right. So we will pick it back up next week. So we continue with the foundation of, and if you Google the foundation of all good qualities, Lama Tsongkhapa, you can find it's all over the internet if you want to find the actual text. As I say, it's only 2 or 3 pages. But we'll continue going through the verses next week. All right. Have a great night.